Good morning. Welcome to the second day of our dialogue on war, legacies, and peace in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia here at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington. Before we start our plenary session today, we have a short welcome video from Senator Tom Carper of Delaware, who, as he will explain, is the last Vietnam veteran serving in the Senate.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm United States Senator Tom Carper from the state of Delaware. I'm proud to serve as the last Vietnam veteran now serving in the United States Senate. It's an honor for me to welcome you to this dialogue on war, legacies, and on peace. As a 23-year veteran of the United States Navy who served as Navy P-3 aircraft mission commander for many years, 3 tours in Southeast Asia, I know all too well the importance of building connections for lasting peace in the region. I've been back to Vietnam several times in the decades since I served there as a young naval flight officer with this mission of peace building in mind. My first trip was in 1991, a month after serving my last P-3 mission and retiring as a Navy captain. At that time, I led a bipartisan 6-member congressional delegation of Vietnam veterans back to Southeast Asia. And our mission was twofold. First, to find out what happened to the MIAs whose bodies were never recovered. And second, to try to meet with the incoming leaders of Vietnam and explore the possibility of moving toward normalizing relations, only if the fate of the MIAs could be resolved. It was during that first delegation, years before diplomatic relations were restored, when I witnessed a breakthrough emerge between our two countries. And on my most recent visits with President Pham in 2016, I saw how the strength of our relationship between our countries has grown. We've come a long way in our relationship with Vietnam since I first visited Southeast Asia during the middle of a war that took 58,000 American lives and many more Vietnamese lives. And now both countries are continuing conversations to build meaningful connections across oceans and across cultures, which is why this conference is invaluable to the missions of the U.S. Institute of Peace. And now I'll share with you the same words that I used several times while addressing audiences in Vietnam on my most recent visit. If you want to travel fast, go alone. If you want to travel far, go together. And more our two countries are electing to go together. And if we do, I'm convinced that we'll end up traveling a whole lot further than either of us could have gone just on our own. So let me just close by saying this to all of our veterans out there. No matter what branch of service you've served in, thank you for your service. I'm a Navy guy, loved it. My dad and a bunch of my uncles and all are as well. But whenever I meet Vietnam veterans or other veterans and service members from other branches, I remind them that while we wear different uniforms, we're all on the same team. I like to say, different uniforms, same team. And that's especially true of so many folks in this room who defended our country at a critical time in our nation's history. So thank you. God bless you. Thank you.
Welcome to everyone. Good morning, and welcome to this discussion of USIP's new Peaceworks report, Pathways to Reconciliation: How Americans and Vietnamese Have Transformed Their Relationship. My name is David Scheffer, and I am a professor of practice at Arizona State University in its Washington, D.C. operations. I have the honor this morning of moderating this conversation. I'd like to first briefly introduce USIP, the War Legacies Dialogue Project that brings us here today, and this report. I'll then hand over to the report's authors, Dr. Anthony Wells Dung and Dr. Carl Stauffer, to present the report, followed by reactions from our discussants, Ambassador Pham Long Dung and John McAuliff. We will have time for questions at the conclusion of our discussion, and we'll take them both in the room and online. If you are tuning in online, please feel free to submit your questions while our discussion is ongoing. The United States Institute of Peace is a national, nonpartisan, independent institute founded by Congress to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict. The Institute pursues its mission by linking research, policy, training, analysis, and direct action to support those who are working to build a more peaceful, inclusive world. In partnership with Congress, USIP launched a multi-year project to foster greater dialogue both in and between the United States and Vietnam on war legacy issues and reconciliation. This important report takes an in-depth look at reconciliation on the context of Vietnam and how American and Vietnamese civilians have transformed their relationship over the past 50 years. The discussion we will have today offers an opportunity to look more closely at how reconciliation has progressed, including the issues that galvanized the reconciliation processes and the ways in which reconciliation proceeded, despite considerable political sensitivity surrounding the conflict. The report also discusses how to maintain and protect reconciliation efforts through the global political realignments we are seeing today. The report's authors are here on stage with me. I want to introduce them. Dr. Andrew Wells Dung, hand up please, is a senior expert on Southeast Asia at USIP. He leads the Vietnam War Legacies and Reconciliation Initiative. Dr. Wells Dung joined USIP following over 15 years of experience with international non-governmental organizations in Vietnam, including as Oxfam's Senior Governance Advisor and Catholic Relief Services Country Representative. He has also worked on China, Cambodia, and Laos. In these roles, he designed and led programs in education, disability rights, UXO landmine risk reduction, environmental and health policy advocacy, and judicial reform with a range of Vietnamese governmental and non-state partners. Dr. Carl Stauffer is a senior expert on reconciliation at USIP. He has more than 30 years of experience in 37 countries as both a practitioner and academic studying reconciliation processes. Before joining USIP, Stauffer was associate professor at the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding at Eastern Mennonite University. While in academia, Stauffer also functioned as the academic director of the Koch's Scholars Program in Switzerland and co-director of the Zare Institute of Restorative Justice. Stauffer served 16 years in South Africa, holding positions of Regional Peace Advisor for the Southern Africa region, Program Director of the African Peacebuilding Institute, and Education and Training Coordinator for the LETSEMA Conflict Transformation Program. Now, just before I hand it over to both Andrew and Carl, who are the authors of the report, I just want to briefly mention, why am I here? Why am I standing up here as moderator? I just go way back with Vietnam, but in an eclectic way. I was in the last draft in January of 1972, got a high number and didn't have to go. But Vietnam was very much in my mind at that time when I was in college. In the 1980s, as an international lawyer, I began to write articles and become engaged in advocacy for our recognition of the government of Vietnam, something that I think John McAuliff here recalls from the 1980s. And then in the 1990s, I was with Dr. Madeleine Albright at the UN when we actually recognized Vietnam in 1995, something that she was very dedicated to seeing happen. As Ambassador at Large for War Crimes Issues in the Clinton administration, I was also deeply involved in Cambodia, the relationship between Cambodia and Vietnam with regard to the atrocities of the Pol Pot region period. And we built the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, which ultimately convicted Khieu Samphan and Nguyen Chea of genocide against the ethnic Vietnamese during that period, and also Doik, head of Tuol Sleng prison, for his torture and murder of Vietnamese prisoners of war at Tuol Sleng prison. And then finally, in the 2012 to 2018, when I worked with the UN as special expert on the Khmer Rouge trials in Cambodia, I was deeply engaged at that time with the relationship with Vietnam in that context. So I come to this with great interest. I've read the report line by line. It's tremendous, and I'm so looking forward now to your presentations on this, Carl and Andrew.
Thanks a lot, David, for the introduction to us and the report. It's my pleasure to introduce the report. Carl and I will be taking turns sharing some of the contents and process that we've been undertaking for the last 2.5 years, I think. It's been a long process, not quite as long as the process that it describes, but it is an example of how at USIP we can bring together our regional centers, so myself with the Asia team and Carl with the Peace Processes team, to describe the intersection between a story of reconciliation between peoples and countries and the theory and practice of reconciliation in peace building globally. I think I've been thinking about these things for 15 or more years. I was part of an Asian peace building network when I was at Catholic Relief Services. And at that time, there was a great literature about reconciliation in many contexts, but not much about Vietnam. And now we see this story of post-war Vietnam and American and Vietnamese relationships is an amazing case of peace building in the 21st century that's more and more appreciated. There are not that many great stories like this, and so this is one that is really core to the mission of USIP. We don't want to paint a rose-colored version of this narrative. It took a long time for reconciliation to get started, and there have been many challenges along the way. Political struggles and different viewpoints within each country, and very serious questions to address. And we especially talk about the role of the search for missing soldiers and civilians from the war, which is a feature of every war, but it's had greater prominence in the Vietnam War and the post-war period perhaps than any other conflict. And the second is the effects of Agent Orange, which is a unique feature of this war. And both of the MIA and Agent Orange stories, importantly, have affected both Americans and Vietnamese. They were issues that kept the countries apart at earlier points in the post-war period, but have since become areas of cooperation and even a foundation for the relationship. And to some extent, this has happened with Cambodia and Laos as well. So this shift from obstacles to common interests and basis for cooperation around war legacies occurred for many reasons. A large part is the role of veterans and peace movements in both countries. Veterans and peace movements are overlapping categories, actually, such as in the photo that you're looking at, which is at Sun Sun Hill in Binh Dinh, where a group of US veterans traveled several years ago as part of the search for mass graves from the war. A second important characteristic is the role of the Vietnamese diaspora in US-Vietnam relations, and we discuss this in the report as well. This is not unique to the Vietnam War. There are diasporas from many countries, but it's notable in the diversity and size of the group. There are multiple sources of trauma across generations, so both during the war before 1975 as well as after. So we include all of these elements in the story of post-war US-Vietnam relations and reconciliation. Of course, we also include the story of diplomatic normalization and now the comprehensive strategic partnership established last year, which we heard about in yesterday's plenary. Both governments have played invaluable roles, as we've seen in the remarks from members of Congress, in the remarks by Ambassador Ted Osius yesterday in his book, Nothing is Impossible. In many cases, the government action has taken place after private citizens took steps on their own and took risks to engage with the others. So if we have a thesis to the report, I think it's this, that societal and people-to-people reconciliation has been a key to the U.S.-Vietnam relationship. And we compare and contrast that with other examples of post-war reconciliation between France and Germany, and between the U.S. and Japan. And we also point out ways in which international reconciliation is both similar and different to reconciliation within a country among different ethnic or religious or political groups. And we draw lessons that apply from both of those. So I'll pass now to Carl, who will introduce some of the first part of the report about reconciliation.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, David and respondents. It's really a pleasure to be on this panel together, and for all of you, looking forward to the conversation. For me, this is deeply personal and professional work. I was born and raised in Vietnam, spent the first 10 years of my life in Saigon, and remember the Tet Offensive, and remember leaving Saigon in 1975, about 3 weeks before Saigon was incorporated to the rest of the country. And so this is a combination of personal and professional work, with my background in reconciliation, being able to take those lenses and look at Vietnam has been a deep privilege. And let me say this, reconciliation is a challenge to define, to understand, and to frame, and has always been. It has often been characterized by, shall we say, anecdotes and inspiring stories of heroic enemies who have reconciled in some form or another, but most of those stories sometimes feel out of reach to us. And so part of the work that I am involved with USIP is to bring reconciliation into the fold of practice, to understand the frameworks, the values, and the practices that can actually build and create reconciliation. So it was a joy to be able to apply those very thinking and thoughts and theories to this incredible case of US-Vietnam relationships. And many folks have already said, I don't need to say it again, but it is a remarkable relationship. For our paper, we wanted to look at reconciliation a little bit more in some more detail. We look at the idea of it's a construction of social political cohesion across individual, family, community, and nations. When we say constructing cohesion, social cohesion, we mean restoring meaningful relationships. We mean nurturing a sense of the common good. We're looking out for each other, not just our own interests, and establishing a future view in which all the conflicting parties see a role for themselves. That's different than necessarily a uniform future view. We can have a diverse set of future views together, but as long as there's room for all of us to see a place to flourish in that future. Why the use of reconciliation lens? What has happened as we look at reconciliation and place that lens on the US-Vietnam relationships is three things, many things, but three things I want to point out. It has increased the empathy, the empathic response on both sides. And what is empathy? Really, empathy is to understand the other side, to get into the shoes, as we often say, of the other side. And empathy allows people to keep their identity. It gives recognition and dignity to their story, and it's a respectful way of interacting. And so that empathy is key. It comes in many words: political goodwill, confidence-building mechanisms, trust building. Secondly, reconciliation can hold the narrative shifts. Well, first of all, it can bring the narrative shifts to pass that are necessary for peace building. If there's no connection, if there's no people-to-people contact, we run the risk of running in ignorance and not knowing anything about the other group. And that separation without any encounter leads to frozen narratives. And one of the important things of reconciliation is to see narrative shifts, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and how we seize upon those. The work of Winslade and Monk on narrative mediation talk about narrative as something that is a conflict-saturated story during the war and can stay, we can get stuck in that conflict-saturated story after the war unless we search together with other conflicting parties to find alternative stories. And that's part of the work of reconciliation. Reconciliation also is the container for many paradoxes and complexities that we face in a post-war situation. And what I mean by that is all conflicts, all violent conflict has narratives of chosen traumas and chosen glories that we like to highlight, that we like to use as weapon against each other. There's also, as the Haitian historian Trulot says, our histories are full of silences and mentions. And the US-Vietnam War and the US-Vietnam relationship has all of those things, silences and mentions. It has chosen traumas and chosen glories. And part of reconciliation is to make a space for those to come to the fore and for truth to become prominent. When we think about reconciliation, we often think about past and future, but we don't always think about horizontal and vertical. Horizontal reconciliation is between communities and civic society groups that carry a similar or equal power balance and asymmetry in the conflict. Vertical and horizontal reconciliation refers to the citizenry with the government or the governing leaders and the governance structures. And often we concentrate on the horizontal reconciliation because that seems to be a little bit quote unquote easier. And often we neglect the vertical and the horizontal, the vertical relationship because we feel or let me say the government leaders are often not as affected by the conflict as those on the ground. And so often there's not the urgency for that kind of reconciliation. But in this case, we see the citizenry and the government in both the United States and Vietnam wrestling with this vertical, horizontal reconciliation. Really, reconciliation is best looked at on a spectrum from the rejection of vengeance, which is the first step, stop the killing, the bloodshed, to tolerance, which we know is not sustainable. It's a short-term ceasefire in relationship, if you will, but not something that we can build a future peace on. And when we get to recognition of the other, this becomes that central place where reconciliation can begin to flourish. And that recognition of the other is to say the enemy who we have subhumanized, we are willing to look at their human existence and their human story and acknowledge it. Apology and pardon is often part of this process, but not always. And that's one of the complications, obviously, in this situation and many other situations where there hasn't always been formal apology or pardon from the powers that be. At the same time, we're moving towards what we call thick reconciliation, from thin to thick, or minimum to maximum, when we look at the idea of a society that's committed to mutual justice and collaboration, or societies committed to each other's mutual justice and collaboration. So reconciliation has many theories of change or strategies of change. I'm not going to go through all of these. This is not, you didn't ask to be in an academic class today. But you'll see all of these as theories of how do people change in reconciliation. Is it when we can keep our identities and respect and recognize and dignify those identities? Is it capacity building of skills that brings reconciliation? Is it when we have this encounter and it's healthy and it's positive and it's constructive? Is it when we find shared goals that we both feel strongly about and we can work together on? Is it when we include women and youth and many marginalized groups as many diverse groups from the society who've been affected by the war in the peace-building process? Is it through cultural exchange, arts and peace-building and storytelling? Is it when we work at personal and collective trauma healing, recovery, and resilience? Whatever your theory is, Vietnam-US relationship and this reconciliation case study has elements of all of these in it, which is what has made it the success that we believe it is. I'm going to turn it over to Andrew now to take it from here, and then come back at the end to look at some of the lessons we learned along the way.
Right, so after we present concepts of reconciliation, theories of change, and some comparative cases. The body of the report describes efforts at U.S.-Vietnam relations through citizen diplomacy, government action, and the involvement of the Vietnamese diaspora. So these are what we identify as some of the drivers of this process from both countries. So I'd like to share a few cases and examples that are described in the report. Some have also come up in other sessions of the dialogue. And then assess how these fit or not in the spectrum of reconciliation that Carl introduced. So on citizen diplomacy, already in the 1980s, before there were diplomatic relations, there were groups of Americans and Vietnamese traveling back and forth to try to build ties, bring aid, develop relations at a citizen's level. So this is a picture of one such Americans educators delegation from various universities at the Hien Lung Bridge in Quang Tri, the former DMZ, in 1987. After that trip, which was organized by John McAuliff, sitting here on my left, that's you in the middle, right, John, with the camera?
Mary is there.
Okay. They made a presentation at the Association of Asian Studies conference. And this shows the importance of universities, academics in this process, in doing research and staying involved with Vietnam over the years and making ties with Vietnamese university counterparts. It wasn't easy to travel at that time for Americans or for Vietnamese. So these were important steps to opening up more relations. A few years after that, the first effort by Vietnamese Americans to provide humanitarian assistance after the war started after a return visit by Chun Van Ka, who was here yesterday. I don't see him here today. Started a group called Vietnam Assistance for the Handicapped. And initially his effort was to help wounded ARVN, Southern Vietnamese veterans, and that spread then to include all people with disabilities in all parts of the country. VNAH worked closely with USAID. It expanded over time to also Agent Orange survivors, and brought along US veterans and Vietnamese Americans to help. That's the picture on the left. On the right, we have tree planting with Peace Trees Vietnam, which we heard about from Claire Juncker yesterday. So Geraldine Brousseau in the middle there behind the tree is one of the founders of Peace Trees, seen there planting trees together with Quang Tri province leaders, including Hoang Nam, who also co-founded Project Renew. So again, these were efforts by, in this case, families of US veterans coming to Vietnam, meeting and working with local groups in very heavily war-affected areas. And so these efforts grew over time to become really sustained effort over decades, and have gotten support from the US and Vietnamese governments. And finally, on the governmental level, I'm sure we've all heard about the efforts of Senator Patrick Leahy, and seen here with the late General Nguyen Chi Vinh, who, as Deputy Minister of Defense, was the main counterpart for U.S. war legacy remediation efforts in recent years. The personal relationship that developed between Senator Leahy and General Vinh, as well as many others, are examples of how trust is developed both at an individual and systemic level. And this has happened through bipartisan support in the US. It's happened working with different administrations and leadership in both countries. And so importantly, this is always linked back to war legacies the needs of UXO survivors, veterans, people affected by Agent Orange, to receive both material and livelihood and social support. So these are just a few of the examples. There are more in the report. There are many more out there, including in this room, right? Where do these fit on the spectrum that Carl shared a few minutes ago? So I mean, I think we've definitely gone past the minimum thin improvements side and reached the middle recognition of the other point. That's the key. And we're making efforts to move further to the right on apology and pardon and mutual justice and collaboration. As Carl said, there has not been a formal apology, nor is there one demanded at this point. There have been statements by U.S. leaders talking about moral responsibility and the need to validate the experience of everyone who suffered in the war. There certainly have been efforts at mutual justice and a lot of collaboration to address these legacies. So I think there are efforts to move towards the thick reconciliation side, and the question we ask is how to continue to develop that. And then in terms with these signposts of reconciliation, so some of the aspects of how we understand what's included in progress towards reconciliation. In dealing with the past, right, again, there's no formal process like a truth commission. There's efforts such as the one we heard about yesterday that USIP is involved with the War Remnants Museum to have a permanent exhibit. There are definitely efforts between diplomats and citizens in the diaspora to talk about the past. I think there's more that can be done in this area as well. A common Vietnamese phrase that we hear is "khép lại quá khứ, hướng tới tương lai." So putting the past aside and looking to the future, which is a very positive statement in terms of its future orientation, right, and desire to build new relationships, point two. But I do ask the question of, is putting the past aside the same as dealing with it? And sometimes it is, but sometimes I think there are memories that also need to be brought in. The second point about new relationships and norms we assess as the most advanced of these three. There have been, in addition to the kinds of relationships that we've mentioned, also a lot of students going back and forth from both countries, business relationships, Amerasians in the U.S., coming from the U.S. to Vietnam, going back to Vietnam, and some formal relations like sister cities and exchanges that are happening at government levels as well. And finally, on constructing just societies, these efforts to deal with physical war legacies do have a vision of a more just society in them. They're not about reparations, it's about humanitarian assistance that will support people who have been harmed to have lives of dignity and be part of the kind of societies that both Vietnamese and Americans want to create. A final aspect of this is memorialization. So on the bottom left there is the War Remnants Museum that we're working with. Bottom right, a group of US and Vietnamese veterans at the foot of Hamburger Hill in Thừa Thiên Huế province, where there was UXO clearance and a small museum built with support from the US Embassy that finished last year. A lot of the efforts to search and account for missing from the war. So at the upper right, that's a video interview with the family of Vietnamese fallen soldier that USIP conducted a few years ago. And then the formal memorial sites and cemeteries. The one pictured is in the Quang Chi Citadel, which was one of the most horrible battles of the war in 1972. And I appreciate it in that it is open and neutral for everyone who died in that battle, right? It's a incense burner at the top there that anyone can go up and offer memory for. So from both the North and South Vietnamese sides. So I'll stop there and pass back to Carl to talk about a few of the lessons that we want to draw.
So to nuance this a little bit with specifically U.S.-Vietnam relationships, we identified 8. There could have been more, there could have been less. These are the 8 that seemed most prevalent to us as we did this study. So the first is around separation. Separation can be beneficial. It's certainly important if that's the only way we can keep the killing from going forward, etc. But the real question is separation by itself is not healing. It's not repair. So what do we do in the times of separation? And what became very clear when the U.S. government and the Vietnam government were not ready for bilateral relationships those first 20 years after the conflict, then the citizen diplomacy stepped in and built a significant social network and network of trust that the politicians were able to build on once they decided they were ready to have this conversation. And so we think that's significant and would encourage other post-conflict situations where there's separation of sorts to think about how can we encourage, create, generate citizen diplomacy to fill that gap. The second, and they're in no particular order, early emphasis on recovery from the war violence can lay a foundation for multifaceted cooperation. What's become clear is when we move towards the most important material and tangible repair and reparations that we can do, the more likely it is that we can then look at the symbolic and the intangible and move into a thicker reconciliation. And so it was very important to identify, for instance, the Agent Orange and the damage of the Agent Orange and take that on and the UXO immediately, or at least at the very beginning of the bilateral relationship. And then we could build some of the more ethereal relational aspects of reconciliation and other creative efforts at building reconciliation and peace. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Third, we recognize the need for both vertical and horizontal reconciliation, which I mentioned a little bit already. I think in the US-Vietnam case, where the relationship, there's been great government-to-government reconciliation, there's been great citizen diplomacy. Is there now a time in the next future season where both the citizens and the governments can cooperate on issues that are particularly important to all of us and look at this as a collaborative effort like climate or the environment? Fourth, cultivate interdependence in reconciliation. Reconciliation, this is particularly important for reconciliation between groups that live in one country and one geographical space. But even in the situation of US and Vietnam relationship, that interdependence is absolutely critical. And the CSP is probably the most prominent and public marker of that interdependence. But I think we can also think about many things that have already been mentioned by Andrew between the diasporas and the different groups that have experienced similar suffering and pain in the war. Victims and survivors of Agent Orange on both sides of various forms of trauma and violence. When those folks come together, the interdependence becomes more clear. Fifth, we look at the need to recognize both the past and the future, as Andrew has already talked about quite a bit, and I think one of the best examples of this is, and for those who were at the excellent presentation on the War Remnants Museum, this idea that we're not going to replace the narrative of the war and the truth-telling of the war and all that happened, but we also want to add to that story the decades of reconciliation work that has taken place so that people can feel the full cycle of reconciliation when visiting that memorial. Fifth, adopt a multi-dimensional approach to reconciliation to protect against geopolitical realignments. This is really just saying, as the U.S.-Vietnam relation strengthens, and we continue to strengthen all of the different ways that we've been talking about reconciliation going forward, this will allow that relationship not only to get stronger, but also to protect against invariably geopolitical pressures that are going to come against either one of our countries in different ways. And if we're strong in one part of the relationship and there's a lot of pressure in another part, we can lean on the strength of those other parts when we're feeling weak or pressured in the other parts. And so I think this is an analogy of what we're looking at as far as this is concerned. And of course this involves specifically the role of China also in the region, and the role of Vietnam in the ASEAN, and other aspects of regional reconciliation. Seventh, encourage reconciliation dialogues with and within diaspora communities. I think we've spoken about that fair enough, but I think one of the things we're understanding is that by the very nature of the diaspora community, the narrative of conflict is often frozen. It's stuck from the time that the diaspora left the country. And it's a different narrative, a different experience for those who stayed in the country, who went back to the country, who are negotiating the daily conflicts in and out. And so it's important for these to learn from each other, to speak to each other, and to find collaborative ways to work together. And finally, capitalize on the narrative shifts in reconciliation. We end with this because narrative is not just story or words or written text. Narrative are the ideas, the ideologies, the cultural aspects, and we build our reality on narratives. In other words, we act on the ideas that we believe. And so there have been certain narrative shifts in this conflict between the US and Vietnam during after the war that have allowed for this reconciliation to go forward. We would name two prominent ones: the end of the Cold War as we know it, and the relaxing of some of those relationships and mixed economics and so on that allowed a relationship to grow there at the economic level between the US and Vietnam. The second shift was the attitude of the citizenry in the United States, and I think also in Vietnam. And as those shifts in attitude with more empathy towards each other have allowed this reconciliation to flourish. And we want to continue to think about how do we build, create, or if you will, form the narrative of what is the future reconciliation that we can imagine between our two countries. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take I'm going to make one comment, and then I'm going to move straight to our discussants. I find this fascinating because I come from the accountability side of post-conflict situations where massive atrocity crimes have been committed, and then how do you achieve accountability, both in the interests of international justice and also of the domestic victims and their need for justice. I think it's imperative that those who are involved on the accountability side be far more conscious of what Andrew and Carl have written in this report that exists and is of great merit on the reconciliation side. I think they can work in dual tracks, but they need to understand each other. And I say that particularly for the prosecutors, the judges, defense counsel, investigators. They need to understand what the reconciliation process is about far more than they currently do, so that there's more synergy between these two tracks in a post-conflict society. I'll just say that when I was negotiating the creation of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, it was refreshing because the local groups wanted to also they wanted the court, but they also wanted a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They needed that at the community level, at the local level. And we were able to do both of them in what was probably the more successful model of the two-track system, which we failed at in the Balkans. We sort of got there in Rwanda with the Gacaca courts, and we failed at in Cambodia. We built the court, but we didn't build a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Cambodia, a society that is totally still traumatized. I will say this, the one good news, on this track from the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia is that we enabled the judges to issue reparation awards upon judgment of guilt, only of guilt, but those reparation awards were tailored not towards massive infusions of money, because that didn't exist, but rather a lot of cultural, artistic, community-based projects that civil society brought to the judges. The judges validated them as proper reparations that should be fully funded by governments and civil society, and they had to sort of prove as applicants for this that they would be fully funded, and then the judges said, great, this is the reparation award. Write a play, develop a museum, get out in the community, talk about all of this. Those were the reparations awards from that court, and it was one effort to try to instill this other track of reconciliation. With that said, I'm going to move to Ambassador Pham Lan Dung, currently acting president of the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. She is also the president of Asian Society of International Law and vice president, secretary general of the Vietnam Society of International Law. She served as dean of international law faculty at DAV from 2008 to 2015, and leader of many MOFA research programs in international law and international organizations. And then John McAuliff is the executive director and founder for the Fund for Reconciliation and Development. He has been an active participant in the civil rights, peace, and equitable development movements in the United States since the 1960s. In 1985, he founded the Fund for Reconciliation and Development. McAuliff is recognized as an expert on the history of U.S. Indochina relations and maintains strong contact with key people in the region and Washington. His current program work is largely focused on achieving normalization with Cuba. So I will begin by asking Ambassador Pham Lan Dung for her comments on the report. Sure, go ahead.
Yes. I'm very honored to be part of this launching event, and I would like to thank USIP for giving me this opportunity. My sincere congratulations to the two authors of a very impressive work. This is one of the most, if not the most insightful and comprehensive research on US-Vietnam conciliation, which captures the complex, multidimensional, multi-level, and nonlinear process of reconciliation between the two nations. The report goes beyond merely describing the evolving relationship between the two nations and delves into the root causes of the issues in pragmatic, political, and cultural approach. Compared to the existing literature, most of what we have up to now consists of memoirs and narratives, with very few academic studies. That's why this report stands out as a valuable contribution. It offers a comprehensive approach by providing not only a solid theoretical framework as explained by Dr. Carl just recently, but also a wealth of practical evidence and real-world examples. I'm quite confident that this will be a valuable resource for future studies on US-Vietnam reconciliation, as well as a model for healing in other global conflicts. For policymakers, this report identifies the remaining gaps, offering insights into areas that need further improvement. The report has been written by American authors. However, it demonstrates a deep understanding of not only the US, but also Vietnam's history, political and social context, culture, and psychology. And the author did a great job of keeping a quite balanced and objective approach in analyzing and describing different aspects of the reconciliation process from both US and Vietnam sides. And it has touched upon basically every single aspect of the process, even the most controversial, most sensitive and debatable. And when it comes to the difficult parts, the two authors have found the best possible way to express their opinions, at the same time not causing unnecessary controversy and confrontation and delivering unobjective judgments. I think that the report also makes an accurate conclusion about the connection between trust and reconciliation process, which aligns very much with with what President Biden and General Secretary State President Tolam mentioned in their recent meeting 2 weeks ago. As trust has grown over time, the process has moved from weaker to stronger forms of reconciliation, or as mentioned in the report, from thin to thick reconciliation, and from separation to cooperation in many areas. And we all do agree with me that what we have done is miracle. But as Senator Leahy words, we have come a long way, we have further to go. The report, the remarkable part of the report underscores the instrumental role of of citizen diplomacy, people-to-people interconnection in kickstarting and driving the US-Vietnam reconciliation process. By showcasing concrete examples of individual organizational efforts, the report convincingly argues for the powers of bottom-up initiative in bridging divides and shaping public opinion. While this approach is accurate, I would like to suggest some additional points to the report that hopefully will make it more comprehensive from the perspective of Vietnamese people. First, the report briefly touches on reconciliation as a two-way street, but it does not pay enough attention to Vietnam's early proactive efforts to reach out to the United States after war. As early as in 1975, Vietnam showed a strong willingness to reconcile with the US, signaling the country was ready to move forward despite the severe war consequences. Prime Minister Pham Dung at that time decided to welcome delegations of US congressmen and senators to Vietnam in late 75 and early 76, which was one of the first signs. At the same time, Vietnam was engaging in the US engaging with the US on sensitive issues like the recovery of the remaining US POW and MAI. High-level talks were also held between deputy ministers in Paris. Moreover, in 78, Vietnam made a significant decision to drop its demands for war reparations, removing a major obstacle to normalizing bilateral relations. This decision demonstrated Vietnam's desire to focus on the future rather to remain trapped in the grievance of the past. Second, even though citizen diplomacy plays an important role in Vietnam-US reconciliation, I do believe that the process cannot be fully understood without appreciating the role of government and track one diplomacy, which would be better if it could be more explicitly reflected in the report. From the early stage, long before the official normalization of the diplomatic relations, the government's foreign policy paved the way for the reconciliation. As Vietnam transitioned through the post-war era, its domestic and international policy shifted toward a more open, outward-looking approach that sought reconciliation not only with the US, but with other former enemies. Both governments have actively worked on promoting cooperation in various fields, thereby creating favorable conditions for reconciliation process. So all of this have shown us that if there had not been the orientation of governments, the reconciliation process would not have been able to come this far, at least from the perspective of Vietnam. There is another point, which is the justice action of the victim, especially the legal cases from the Vietnamese organization like VAVA and some individuals like the Vietnamese French citizen Chen Tonga against chemical companies that produce and provide Agent Orange. So I think that it could be better if this issue have been touched upon in the report. I would also like to make some clarification relating to the terminologies used in the report. It's actually relating to the Vietnamese name of the war. It is actually not the American war, but it's as a matter of fact, it's a little bit longer, the war of resistance against American aggression. The meaning is that it was not a war against, it was a war against aggression for national independence and reunification, not a war about ideology and civil war. So it shows how different the two countries look at the essence of the war. And last but not least, I would love to see in the recommendation part 2 points. The need to strengthen the Vietnam and US government's commitment to address the war consequences. And second, emphasizing on the role of youth and next generation forward the future and sustained reconciliation. So having said that, I would like to once again congratulate the two authors for their excellent work. I enjoyed every line of the report, and I do encourage our colleague here and the public broadly not to hesitate to start reading the report, and you will enjoy it very much. And I believe that the report will attract the attention not only of policymakers and scholars, but also a broad public in Vietnam and probably in the US also. Last but not least, I would like not to only congratulate the author, but also want to thank the author for their beautiful piece of work. And you help us and our young generation a lot to understand us better and to be in a better position to develop our mutual cooperation in the future. Thank you.
John?
It's great to be here once again. You guys don't realize it, but because of the lights, it's very hard for us to see you there. But the coming here reminds me of when I used to come here in the early 90s when Dick Solomon was president. And we discussed whether USIP could help move the two countries towards normalization and reconciliation. And Dick said, no, we can't get support from Congress for this. It's way too premature. So I would say that having this event and what Andrew has been doing is itself an important stage in the reconciliation process. You should be proud of what you've done. The picture that was shown is important in a couple of ways. When we started in 1985, my premise was that reconciliation meant accepting the other side as it was, philosophically, culturally, politically, not making any demands of difference, even though there were differences. In that picture, I said Mary McDonnell was there, who went on then to create a major program of cooperation between the Social Science Research Council and the Vietnamese Academy of Social Sciences. Also in the picture was Kevin Bowen, who created or was the head of the William Joyner Center, which became a major sector for interaction between Vietnamese writers and American writers, mostly veterans. Kevin and I and Cora Weiss were honored by President Tolam in New York a couple of weeks ago with the Friendship Medal. And the dialogue around that and my preparation for a trip we're doing in the last 2 weeks of April around the 50th anniversary, which you're welcome to join, reminds me of the different language. For us, April 30, 1975 was the end of the war. It wasn't 73, it was 75 that the war was over. For the Vietnamese, it's the anniversary of reunification. It's a whole different sense of what was going on over that period of time. And this report can't go into it, and I think American politics are not yet ready to do it, but ultimately, I think what's happening now emphasizes the total loss of a war that did not have to happen. One of the projects we did was bring OSS people back who had worked with Ho Chi Minh and General Giap in Tan Chau, and Giap was still alive, and there were a number of others, and some of the Viet Minh came and did a program. And there's lots of history that sort of surfaced in that. But one of the things that it emphasized was that we didn't have to join the French. We could have followed Roosevelt's policies, and there would never have been a war. There also wouldn't have been a war, American war, if we hadn't supported and replaced the French. And if we had accepted the Geneva Agreement provisions for elections to reunify the country, there wouldn't have been a war. 3 million people would be alive. A generation of economic development would have happened. So somehow we have to come to terms with that unique American responsibility for an event that didn't need to happen. The other thing that I think I would emphasize, because I do a lot of work with Cuba now, and I was thinking when Ambassador Knapp was speaking, if what he characterized as the U.S.-Vietnam relationship of mutual respect and non-intervention existed now with Cuba, there would be no more Cuba work to do. But I think that concept of mutual respect and non-intervention, despite differences, was a crucial part of what normalization was and continues to be, though there are differences, conflicts on different issues. There are many things else to say. One of them is that it's very hard to really get at what happened. The Vietnamese certainly were responsible for excesses in terms of what they did, and Hue is the most prominent of those. But the whole concept of the way we fought the war has never been dealt with. I think of Tonyu Tining, who's quoted in the report, said to me once, you know, what no one talks about is what happened to the villages. Remember, it was Brzezinski and others who had this brilliant concept of drying up the sea in which the guerrillas swam. And that meant destroying villages and moving people into refugee camps. Now, those areas have all been repopulated today, but I don't know if it's the same population and what you know, these are places that had existed for 1,000 or more years, or certainly for hundreds of years, and that continuity was lost. And we've never dealt, we can't, it's hard for them and hard for us to deal with that. The other thing that I would say is that you might want to consult with some experts on the American Civil War and the American Revolution. After, where I live on Long Island, after the American Revolution, there were a lot of people that had to leave Long Island because they sided with the British. They lost their property, and things got very nasty. And I suspect that happened elsewhere after the successful American Revolution. After the Civil War, only veterans of the Union side received veterans' benefits. The Confederate side did not get benefits until after essentially the racist white southern states regained control in the great political compromise in the United States, leading to Jim Crow. Only at that point were Confederate veterans recognized. But I think that whole being somewhat humble in our evaluations of the harshness that happened in '75, the re-education camps, and the discrimination against people who had been part of the Southern government, is something that we've got to come to terms with. I'm now going a little more, let me just finish up with one thing that the Vietnamese diaspora is very important. I think it is, I mean, I'm part of the Irish diaspora, 19th century, and it shapes even now shapes my imagination about the world. But I think that it's generational. There's no way of escaping the fact that it's a generational transformation, that people have to have lived a different life to then go back. And I think that that's where an important part of the future lies. I hope that we will be able to get more American students to go to Vietnam. And it's not surprising how disproportionate it is of the number of Vietnamese students coming here. And you know, we need to find ways to, maybe with more widespread US government funding, to actually make it possible for high school and university students to have experience in Vietnam. So I think I will stop right there, but there are things that maybe can come up in the question. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John. I think we'll open it up for questions now, both from the audience here and online. Yes, in the back. I think, do we have someone with a mic running around or not?
There are mics up at the top. Maybe we could
Perhaps
bring those
if
down.
Someone could bring that down, sorry. Yeah, there you go. She's coming with your mic.
Thank you. My name is Nhan. I come from New York and from Temple University in Philadelphia. I have 2 points to make. First, to congratulate Ambassador Pham Dung, the only female voice on the panel, and which commented on the report that I didn't see. I will add to the report on the 8 points that Stauffer was putting on the first bullet. The first bullet talked about citizen diplomacy. Citizen diplomacy actually started in 1975 with the U.S. Committee for Scientific Cooperation with Vietnam, who shipped like tons of books from the U.S. to Vietnam. That's number one. Number two, on the citizen diplomacy, there was no trip was allowed for the Vietnamese coming to the U.S. At that time, there was an attempt to analyze the situation between Vietnam and the U.S., and we found that if the combat veterans of two countries meet in New York, then it would be like a lesson for the U.S. And it did happen in around the end of 1980, when two combat veterans from Vietnam, with CBS following them to New York in around 1989, something like that. And they met with combat veterans in a village in New York. And they was angry with each other at first, and they found out that they were in the same battle, and in Quang Tri, and both sides has friends that died in the war on that battle, and so they're angry with each other at first, and then they realize that because we have friends that die in the same battle, then they made friends again, right in front of the TV. And so the reconciliation, citizen reconciliation, starting from the most patriotic part of the two countries, the combat veterans. So that one probably is a continuation of today when we talk about the battle. Agent Orange is one part of that. Allow the two defense department of Vietnam and the U.S. meet together all the time to discuss remaining issue of the combat veteran, because they are patriotic element of the two society, and the two society can reconcile very fast.
Thank you very much. The next one here, if you could pass the mic right down to there you go. Thanks.
Yeah, my name is Dat Zutek, and I really like what I heard this morning. I'm just wondering if apology and pardon shouldn't be moved to the end of the process, because it is extremely difficult. So, for example, at the inauguration of Sheinbaum, the new president of Mexico, Spain was not invited, because they still have refused to apologize for what Spain did to the natives of Mexico 600 years ago. I would like to add a little anecdote that every Vietnamese child is taught, was taught and is taught. China and Vietnam share a long history as well as a long border. And many centuries ago, after Chinese invasion number 5, number 6, I don't know, I don't remember. There was, the Vietnamese managed to repel the northern invaders, and one of the Chinese generals, maybe the commanding general, was killed. There was an apology after that event, but it's not what you think. The Vietnamese apologized to the Chinese. And they presented the Chinese emperor with a golden effigy of the general that was killed. We are sorry we had to do this. Please, let's be friends. So apologies are very difficult, and sometimes they are not what you think. Thanks.
I know we've got, the next question is right over here, so you'll have to flip that mic up the seats. Thank you.
I'm John Terzano, formerly of Vietnam Veterans America Foundation, currently with the International Commission on Missing Persons. I was part of the first delegation of Vietnam veterans to go back to Vietnam in 1981. And I'd like to make a suggestion on the apology and pardon, and I would add the word why. You can't get beyond an apology and pardon unless you explain to people why you did it. I can come to terms with my Vietnamese counterparts and sit across the table from Vietnamese, where years ago I would have been given a medal to kill them, and they would have done the same, and reconcile with them. However, it's difficult for me to reconcile with McNamara, Kissinger, Nixon, Johnson, because of their policies, and sending me to fight in what I consider an unjust and moral war. So I think you have to also get at the question, why? Why did they do it? But my real question to you is really about this whole reconciliation process, and what was not mentioned was that this extraordinary journey took place while the United States was waging a different war with Vietnam, not with bombs and guns, but the economic embargo, which went on for 19 years, from 1973 until 1994. The complications of that economic war complicated tremendously this whole journey, and I'd like your comments on that. Thank you.
Would any of you like to take that on? The economic embargo issue? John, is that something?
Well, I agree that that was very important, even after the Vietnamese initiated the Doi Moi, the economic reform process. It was a back and forth process until after the U.S. ended the embargo. And again, working on Cuba as I do, I see a resonance that President Obama could not really do normalization with Cuba because we still had an embargo in place, economic warfare in effect, that we do today. I had commented about some earlier things, if I could say. One is that we should not underestimate President Carter and his trying, especially in the beginning of his administration, trying to open the door with the Woodcock Commission, offering to the Vietnamese normalization, which they were unwilling to do initially, and then when they were willing to do it, and Foreign Minister Tak was in New York, it was the U.S. that walked away from it because the Carter administration, and Brzezinski in particular, had bought into the China alliance scenario. And again, instead of applauding the Vietnamese for doing away with the Khmer Rouge, we went to war again with the Vietnamese financially. That was one of the things Dick Solomon and I always used to talk about. The other thing I wanted that Carter did is he allowed the Vietnamese to come here. Dr. Ton That Tung, who was mentioned in the report, came and tried to talk to people about Agent Orange. And nobody would listen to him at that point. He was in Philadelphia, and I remember a Vietnamese American or a Vietnamese refugee in the audience attacking him as being a communist. And Tung, who was a short man, he sort of reared himself back and said, "I am a member of the royal family of Wei. I am not a communist."
Actually, he didn't join the Communist Party.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, that shut down that and opened a door. The person that organized his trip, I was working for the Friends Service Committee in Philadelphia, did the Philadelphia part of it. But the organizer of it was Ed Cooperman, who was the founder of the U.S. Committee for Scientific Cooperation with Vietnam. Now, that's an uncomfortable role because the U.S. Committee let's say there are a number of members of it that had been members of the US Communist Party or were still members or aligned politically. They weren't the Quakers or the Mennonites or sort of mainstream reconciliation. Ed was ultimately assassinated by a young Vietnamese. And I think those of us people who followed it closely think that that was a political hit, but it was never acknowledged as such. But he was, the last story I would say is Nguyen Ngoc Hung was the Vietnamese veteran who was referred to. He became, again, during the Carter administration, a factor with American veterans, thanks to Morley Safer, who did a 60 Minutes program, which was mostly a hit job on General Giap. Morley was clearly trying to expose Giap for one, but he also interviewed, he doubled the segment time because he had this long interview with Hung, and Hung, if people who know him, is an amazingly deep person. He went on to play a very important role in the Ministry of Higher Education and on these educational exchange programs that have been described. But he came and he did travel around the country and talk to people. The other reconciliation moment that is important is Nguyen Xuan Oanh, Dr. Nguyen Xuan Oanh, who was from Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City, had been an acting prime minister in the old government, a movie producer, a bank creator, and stayed. When all of his class of people fled, he stayed. He did a year of house arrest. And then he wrote about the need to modernize the Vietnamese economy and get rid of the socialist characteristics that the Russians and the Chinese had suggested. And he came here. It took a couple of years because the State Department refused to give him a visa. And the New York Times editorialized that he should get a visa. Finally, he got a visa. We brought him here, this now being the Fund for Reconciliation and Development. We brought him here and talk about reconciliation between him and Vietnamese Americans that he'd known and the American oil companies that tracked him down wherever he was and wanted to talk to him about the potential of oil in the South China or the East Sea. So Tung was a very important factor internally in Vietnam in the Doi Moi process and also in the bilateral normalization process, reconciliation process.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for your comments and additions, stories. It's so rich. There are so many things that we want to bring up and bring into this narrative of reconciliation. Thanks for your contributions to it. And we hope that this report stimulates even more such dialogue.
Thank you all very much for attending, and to our audience online. And I think we're at the hour-and-a-half mark, and we need to terminate this. But obviously, discussions will continue. Thank you.